the value of the currency. As Warren Mosler always said, if you're the currency issuer, you have to choose a buffer stock. That buffer stock could be a commodity. It could be gold. We call that a gold standard. It could be some other commodity or a basket of commodities, which was actually proposed in the United States in the 1930s. It could be a reserve army of the unemployed. That's the buffer stock that most economists advocate. Let's use a huge body of unemployed people to keep the currency strong. The idea is that if you have a lot of unemployed people, workers are scared to try to resist the employer's attempts to keep their wages low. Because the employer can always say, well, I can fire you and hire these unemployed people. They're desperate. They're willing to work for a low wage. So you keep your currency strong and wages low with lots of unemployment. That's the buffer stock that for some reason economists love. We argue it's much better to have an employed buffer stock. It is a much more effective buffer stock, and it has the advantage that you don't waste your labor. You keep your labor fully employed. Okay, so again, I think that this is something new to MMT. So people ask, what is new? Well, it's bringing together these two ideas. So the ideas themselves were not new, but bringing them together into MMT. Another advance made by MMT was to investigate how does the government really spend? When we started this project to develop MMT, I asked academic economists, how does the government really spend? I mean, really, the operations. No academic economist knew how they did that. Okay, so one of the first things we did, Stephanie Bell, and then later Scott Fulweiler and Eric Tamoyne, go into the operations manuals to see how does the government really spend. And it involves coordination among the Treasury, the central bank, private banks, and special bond dealers. Okay. And so we've worked it all out, and it's been published in many different articles. We did it for the United States. It's been done for Brazil. It's been done for Canada. It's been done for the UK. And it turns out the operations are slightly different, but they all perform the same functions. Okay. And we get a lot of criticism about this, but nobody has ever found any flaw in the argument. Okay. And so what we show is there is no financial constraint on the sovereign government. Okay. The operations are very complicated, but the reason that they're complicated is to make sure that it is always true, that the government checks always clear. Government is never financially constrained. Once a budget is agreed to, and in the United States, it takes Congress plus the president, once it is agreed to, the government can always spend up to the budgeted amount. There is no problem. There never are any hitches. Treasury checks never bounce. And that's what the operating procedures ensure. Okay, and finally, I'd say there's probably one other original idea that we can attribute to MMT. Maybe we can find some inklings of it, but I think really recognizing the importance of it was new. And that is that bond sales by the Treasury are not a borrowing operation. Bond sales by the Treasury are part of monetary policy. Warren Mosler was the first one to figure this out. He was a bond dealer, dealt in sovereign government debt, and he figured out how it works. He said, well, when the Treasury sells bonds, we call that borrowing. When the central bank sells bonds, we call that an open market operation. But they have exactly the same impact on the non-government part of the economy, which is they drain reserves. That's all they do. What is a bond sale? It's a reserve drain. You drain reserves out of the banks. So it's part of monetary policy. Doesn't matter who's doing it. It's part of monetary policy. Why do they do it? In order to hit their overnight interest rate target. Okay, well, interest rate targeting is the central bank's responsibility, and it is just part of monetary policy. And of course, this makes sense because we already know governments don't need to borrow their own money. That would be a senseless operation. Governments don't need to borrow their own currency. That would be stupid. Okay, and in fact, they don't. They sell bonds to drain reserves. It's not a borrowing operation. There's never a problem selling the bonds. Okay, you're never subject to bond vigilantes when you sell bonds. Okay, when Warren first said that, and I know precisely when it was because I can find on the post-Keynesian thought discussion group Warren's post to this discussion blog. And my thought was, well, okay, I can do the balance sheets for this, and I know he's right. So, you know, anyone who knew how to do T accounts could see that this was correct, but they'd never put 2 and 2 together, which is that if the Treasury does it, or if the Fed or central bank does it, it's the same thing. And that was the insight of Warren. Okay, so it's not a borrowing operation. All right. It's also true of taxes, by the way. What is a tax payment? It's also a deduction from a bank's reserves. Okay, that's the other way that reserves get debited. Again, there's nothing there to spend. Okay, so taxes are not income. They are a deduction from bank reserves. That's all they are. And then the banks deduct from somebody's demand deposit account, the taxpayer's demand deposit account. So it's just essentially a deduction from a balance sheet entry. That's all a tax payment is. So once you understand these two things, that it's all about debiting reserves, the world looks completely different because you can't debit reserves that aren't already in the banking system. It's like when you go to a magic show and you see the magician pull the rabbit out of the hat, you pretend like you're surprised. You're not really surprised. Okay, you know that he put the rabbit in the hat before he pulled it out. It's not really magic. Well, government can't pull reserves out of banks unless they put the reserves in first. It's the same principle. Okay, so you shouldn't be surprised that the government is pulling reserves out that it put in already before the show. It all comes down to keystrokes, keystroke credits, keystroke debits. Government can never run out of keystrokes. There's no chance the government can ever run out of money. So why does the government sell the bonds? It's so that holders can earn more interest than they earn holding reserves. That's the purpose of bond sales. In the old days in the United States, by old, I mean before the global financial crisis, the Fed paid 0 interest on reserves. So the Fed really couldn't leave excess reserves in the banking system. You had to pull them all out. Otherwise, banks earned 0. After the global financial crisis, the Fed started paying interest on reserves. So now if we don't sell bonds, the excess reserves don't drive the interest rate to 0. The excess reserves only drive the interest rate down to the interest rate that the Fed pays on reserves. Okay, so once you get the full picture of bonds, you start wondering, well, why should we sell them at all? Let's just let the holders of reserves earn whatever interest rate the central bank wants to pay. That will be the base interest rate in the economy. We don't even need the bond sales. They're not a borrowing operation. And if we pay interest on reserves, we don't even need the bonds. Okay. So anyway, it has nothing to do with borrowing. Government doesn't face a borrowing constraint. The government can always make all payments as they come due. The government cannot run out of money. Insolvency in your own currency is impossible. Bond vigilantes have no power. The interest rate is set by the central bank, not by bond vigilantes. Finance is not an issue for the national government. And everything that I've just said so far is a description. It's not a policy. The job guarantee would be a policy to implement. Okay, but how it works is just a description of how it would work. No change in procedures is required. In order, people ask, well, do you think the United States will ever implement MMT? And I say, well, we implemented it in 1789, the founding of the country. It's been MMT ever since, because the US Constitution gave to Congress the authority to issue the currency, and nobody else has that authority. Okay, that goes back to our Constitution. That's the day we became MMT. All right, so MMT is not something to implement. It's a description of the way things work. We do have policies we like, okay, but none of this was policy. So what kind of constraint does the government face? A sovereign government doesn't face a money constraint. There's no financial constraint. It faces a resource constraint and a technical or know-how constraint. If we have the resources and we have the technical know-how, we can always afford to do whatever it is. Okay, so resource constraints are the real constraints we face, not financial constraints. The question is, do you have the know-how and do you have the real resources? Then in that case, then finance is not the constraint. It's just a matter of mobilizing the resources and using your knowledge in order to do what you want to do. Okay, so I'm finishing up with the general, and then I'm going to get to the more specific. The question always is, does this only apply to the United States? Now, it's true, a large percentage of the developers were in the US, okay? So a lot of Americans worked on developing MMT, but not the only ones. So the question is this something peculiar to the issuer of the main international reserve currency? And the answer, I think, is no, okay? Now, people especially in developing countries, especially in south of the United States border, will typically say, well, but we face a balance of payments constraint that the US doesn't face, okay? And that means that we don't have a sovereign currency. My response is the balance of payments constraint is not really a constraint, it's a policy decision. It could be a good decision in some cases to try to constrain your economy to your balance of payment or by your balance of payments, okay? And typically it is done to slow economic growth. And the fear is that if you grow too fast, you're going to import more and your imports will outpace your exports and your trade deficit will grow. Which could be true, so I'm not denying that, okay? But all the main principles of MMT still apply to a country like Brazil. The sovereign government cannot run out of its own currency. It can always afford full employment of all of its domestic resources, including labor. It can make all payments as they come due in its own currency. It can never be forced to default on obligations in its own currency. It can never run out of its own currency, okay? But just like the United States, Brazil faces resource constraints. We face them too, okay? In World War II, we were operating the economy well beyond full employment. We faced resource constraints. In what I hope will be the coming Green New Deal, we could face resource constraints again. Okay, and then you have to decide, you have to prioritize your resources. Okay, but up to full employment of our domestic resources, we can always spend more and do more. Once you reach full employment of your resources, then you have to prioritize and take resources away from other uses. Just like the United States, Brazil faces resource constraints. Countries face domestic resource constraints and external resource constraints. Okay, this is true for the United States too. The US and Brazil can both mobilize all of their domestic resources using their own currency. So there's no question about the ability to do that. Brazil can have full employment. Brazil can have the job guarantee, okay, and utilize all the domestic labor, same as the United States. External resources can be a different matter. The US issues the international reserve currency. The dollar is in high demand all over the world for a variety of reasons. It's really not trade, okay? Countries want the dollar to, in order to manage their currencies. They want the dollar as a safe financial asset. Okay, there's lots of reasons why people want to accumulate dollar assets. And the US is the dominant international reserve currency. That does mean that the external resource constraint on us is not very tight. We can run current account deficits year after year after year and never exhaust the demand for dollars. Okay, this is true. That's not necessarily true for Brazil and many other countries in the world. They can exhaust the external demand for their currency. And what that means is that they face a stricter external resource constraint than the United States does. Okay. I think the constraint is not nearly as tight as Brazilians and others in other countries typically believe. Okay. And so what I'm saying is they start to slow their economy before they really need to. Okay. On the fear that a current account deficit will depreciate the currency and cause inflation. And there are these two great fears about inflation. Sorry, in the United States, when we say depreciate, it's like when you say appreciate. So currency going down in value relative to the dollar. So you can exhaust the external demand for your currency, and you may want to avoid that, and that means you may constrain internal growth excessively. Okay, but at least if we can turn the focus away from balancing the government's budget to realizing what the real constraint is, which is access to foreign resources, then you may be able to make better policy decisions about how to prioritize, for example, what you import, and how open you want your capital account to be, and how much free trade you want to engage in. Do you want to use tariffs? Do you want to have luxury taxes in order to try to reduce imports that maybe don't serve a high public value for Brazil? When you start to realize that the problem is not that the government's going to run out of money. Okay, it's not that the budget deficit is too big. The problem is the demand for external resources, facing a much more limited demand for assets denominated in the Brazilian currency. So let me stop. Probably I went on too long.
Of course not, Professor Randall Wray. It's an honor to listen to you and your opinions and your research and on this subject. Perhaps we could listen to Professor Daniel Negreiros Conceição regarding exactly what you said about the MMT and the restrictions we face in developing countries. Daniel Conceição, if you please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you again to you guys from Corecon for organizing this. Thank you so much, Professor Ray, for helping us drive the debate here in Brazil. And I only want to stress some of the key points from Professor Ray's presentation, because especially when it comes to the supposed failures of MMT, for us to use it as a policy guide. So I agree 100% with Professor Ray when he says that the basic framework of MMT is not specific to any country in the world. It is specific to anywhere that uses a given currency that is issued by the state. So the very basic framework is one in which the state is the creator of the currency. Therefore, it makes absolutely no sense for the state to expect to obtain the currency from others, from people, from the population, before it can add the currency to the economy, right? There's an exercise that I learned from Professor Ray at UNKC, in which we, the students, receive payments in a currency that is created by the professors, the economics department at UNKC. So they create this currency. It's very well printed. It's a beautiful document. But other than that, it has no value to students, right? It's just a pretty document with the signature by the director of the department. So what they do is say, well, okay, I want to purchase things from you using this currency. Those things can vary from tasks that they'll ask us to do to voluntary work, but usually requires for us to do some work in order to obtain the payment from them. And they want to buy those things from us using that currency. But we say, well, we don't want that. I mean, it's just a piece of paper. Until they say, well, but we're going to punish you by taking grades away at the end of the semester if you guys don't pay us a given amount of these papers, of the currency, as a tax that we're imposing. So they create the tax not to finance their spending, but to make us need the currency. And as soon as they do that, well, we start accepting the currency, and we even use it amongst ourselves. Where I purchase things from other students using that. But the key point is that it's not taxes. It can't be taxes that are the things that make the department acquire the currency, because they're the ones creating it. In fact, they used to do this thing at the very beginning of the period where they would say, well, people say that we need to tax you guys in order to spend. All right, so I'm the government. I'm, playing the role of the government here. So I will try to tax you guys in order to spend. And as soon as they try to do that, we say, well, but we can pay the taxes because you guys haven't given us the money yet. Because if you ever are able to get taxes before you give us the money, you need to look for someone that is counterfeiting the money. All right? So you need to be looking for some fraudster, because you're the only one who can create that. And that's exactly the same thing that happens in real economies, right? Taxes are paid using state money. So it's impossible for taxes to come first, because otherwise there's someone defrauding the government by counterfeiting money, right? And that's the same for borrowing, right? Because as much as I can't pay taxes, I can't buy a bond that Professor Ray issues before he gives me the money to buy the bond. And this is something that is possibly not well understood by those who try to look at the economy, at real economies, because it's too convoluted, right? So it's very easy to see when you do this exercise, which is why I've adopted here in my classes, but it's not as easy to see when you have so many things taking place at the same time in a real economy, especially because you could very well start looking at things when governments happen to be taxing, and then you will think, well, maybe it is because, you know, the government is taxing and then it's spending. Just because you started looking at the story, it's what we say in Portuguese, right? Pegar o bonde andando, right? So, which in English translates to you've entered the bus after it was already running, right? So you could have done that. You could have entered the bus after it's been running for a while, and people have received money from the government, and then they pay taxes. And if you start looking after they've just paid taxes, you will have the illusion that it's taxes or that it's bond sales, but it can't be, because taxes and bond sales are just sales of things. Requires for people to have money, either to buy the bonds or to pay the taxes. And so that's very, I think it was a very powerful way of teaching us, and it is one that I've used. And I think 2020 has really allowed us to see these things happen in a much clearer way, right? Especially in Brazil, because remember, Pedro, in Brazil, before the pandemic, we were hearing from the government and from economists all over Brazil that the government was broke, that we could not keep spending as much as we were, and that we needed to cut spending in order to control the public debt, and because we had pretty much ran out of money, right? That was the narrative that they wanted to convince people for all sorts of reasons. They wanted to really, there's a whole bunch of reforms that are based on this lie, but it was a lie. And it was clear that it was a lie because as soon as the pandemic started, what happened? But the government had to admit that it had been lying about not having money to spend. And what it had to do wasn't look for money in order to spend. They knew that they needed, they didn't need to do that. What they had to do was suspend some fiscal rules that are just it's self-imposed. It's things that the legislature, the Congress invented, right? So we have some rules that keep our government from being able to spend as much as it needs. So we had the rules. As soon as the government suspended those rules, the money appeared, because where did it come from? It came from the same place that always allowed government to spend as much as it wanted. The money was created by public spending. And now I know we have this idea that the account that the government has at the central bank represents some sort of coffer that the government uses to spend, but really that's not the case, because semantically, right, by definition, that's not money. So when the government uses the values that it has in that account, it is creating money. It's creating monetary base. It's creating money, which is what it did. It spent, it reduced its account at the central bank in Brazil, and it created money at banks. The bank created bank reserves, and it created money in people's accounts. So that's money creation, right? By definition, there's no debating that. That's semantics. That's the dictionary. If people have problem with that fact, that governments create money when they spend, they need to go fight someone else, someone who created the definitions that we use, right? But that's a fact. The government created the money, and remember that eventually that money will allow people to, especially banks, to buy a lot of bonds, right? Especially in the beginning, because as soon as you add that money to the economy, to the bank's accounts, they have money that is not earning any interest in their portfolios. And what they do, they look for opportunities to turn that money into an interest-earning application. Right? So that's what happened. Now, as soon as that happens, the central bank immediately offers them public debts in order for them to shift, right? To put that non-interest yielding money into an alternative. Just like we do when we get money in our account, we have nothing to do with that money in the bank, so we put it in a savings account, right? That's what we do. We just shift from one account to the other. That's exactly what the government does. If it wants to keep the interest rate from falling, it will offer people a savings, right? It will offer banks mostly a savings account for their reserves, and that's what happened. So this is when we see the public, the bonds, the government bonds rising, but that didn't even help the Treasury to increase its account value, because that is not done between Treasury and the banks. That's done between the central bank and the banks. So as soon as the government tries to replenish its accounts, the opposite happens. Because when it tries to sell the bonds, now the pressure is the opposite, right? It would cause the basic interest rate, the Selic rate, to go up, and the central bank, again, can't allow that to happen. Right? So that's when the central bank helps automatically the Treasury to sell its bonds. So everything that happened in the end, as Professor Ray told us, will make it seem as if, right, if you just look at the equation, you would see that government spending rose by way more than taxes, because people just don't have an income during the pandemic, and the government had to spend a lot more to keep the economy from plummeting. So the government did spend a lot more, right? But and taxes didn't rise. So there's a difference there that has to be met by somewhere, right? From somewhere. Well, if you look at the equation later, you would see that a lot of it becomes bond sales, right? But that's not the story, because before they became bonds, they were money, and that money had been created by the government. So it's only once the government creates the money that then some of that money becomes bonds. The other part might remain as monetary base as bank reserves and as paper money in people's wallets. But the government doesn't even need to be concerned with that, because the central bank will always allow for a difference to be met when the Treasury tries to sell its bonds. So the story is actually reversed, right? We see that the government has created the money, then it became bonds, and whatever else has remained within people's accounts. And the Treasury had no problem meeting the largest primary fiscal result in its history, right? We had a primary fiscal deficit close to R$1 trillion, something of the order of 700 billion reais. That used to be unimaginable, right, before the pandemic. But it happened, and it happened without any difficulty for the government. The interest rates didn't explode, right? In fact, they were record low, especially because the central bank chose them to be record low. So there was no problem from that side. And even whatever inflationary pressures were created, it cannot be accounted for because of deficit spending itself, right? There's a whole bunch of other explanations for the exchange rate pressures, the inflation pressures that we faced. So that story sort of allowed us to really see that it cannot be true that the government needs to get money from people and from banks and taxes in order to spend. And that's actually a fact, because if we remember the beginning of the pandemic, there was absolutely no money to be got, right, to be obtained. The government couldn't have taxed before it spent because people didn't have any money. Everyone was sort of desperate. Even firms, even banks had to ask for help from the central bank in the beginning of the pandemic. So how could it be that the government would ask for money from banks and firms before it spent? It was actually the other way around. It was because the government spent so much that banks and firms had money to purchase bonds and all of that. So, I think 2020 should give us the opportunity to challenge the lie that people have been using, right, to claim that governments really cannot spend what they need in order to face our problems. Now, the second part, I think that the specificity of MMT and developing countries, right? Is it applicable? Well, I think Professor Ray has said it very well. That's sort of a question that really makes no sense, because we're talking, if we're talking about a country in which the central government uses the domestic currency to make payments, then it has to be applicable, because that is what MMT is describing, is what can be done, right, by a central government that creates money when it spends. Now, of course, challenges will be different for different countries, right? And I would say that those challenges are specific even for developed countries, because when we stress the exchange rate difficulties that can arise when an economy is growing, which is basically what people tend to bring up when we talk about developing countries, right? That sort of constraint is the same inflation problem that MMT has stressed all along, right? The MMT has always stressed that you can always stimulate production, domestic production, if you create demand for production, right? But the limits of stimulating production by creating demand, which you can always do because you can create the money, are given by the supply of things that you're trying to buy as you increase spending the economy, right? And that supply, in the case of imported goods, is dependent on the ability to obtain foreign currencies, right? So for a country as the US, really what we're saying is they have the advantage of being able to sell their currency, right? Because everyone wants to accumulate dollars because of the status of dollars as the reserve currency internationally. So that means that a lot of countries try to accumulate those dollars. And when they do, they sort of force themselves to having a trade surplus against the US, just because they're financing that surplus, which becomes a deficit for the US, by purchasing the dollars, right? By accumulating dollars. So as long as that happens, it will force that. But I would still argue that even countries that are able to offer their currencies internationally might face trouble if, as Professor Ray said, conditions change within that determine how much you can purchase internationally with their domestic currencies. For instance, if the US is not facing inflationary pressures at this point because there's a lot of demand for dollars internationally, that could very well change if the demand for dollars was to fall very abruptly. And then it doesn't matter if you're an exporter of currency, or if you're a net importer of currency, or if you're a net exporter of very in-demand commodities. For instance, that would be sort of similar to the situation of being an exporter of oil, right? It's very easy to sell oil internationally, so it gives you the ability to obtain currency from abroad in order to purchase other things. But as soon as demand for oil goes down, countries that have relied a lot on that specific path to obtaining goods that their population needs to consume might face very severe problems. Think about Venezuela, right? They have oil coming out of all of their holes, right? A lot of oil, but if they can't obtain the dollars, the foreign currency that they need to use to buy what their population need, those oil reserves will not help them. It's kind of the same with countries that can offer their foreign currency, right? If people stop demanding that currency, maybe it will also be a problem. So I would argue that instead of us focusing so hard on trying to make sure that we can export in order to obtain the dollars that we need in order to import our goods, we should be looking more in terms of why is it that we need those dollars so much? Because if it comes down to situations like in the past, when we needed the dollars to pay up foreign debts, That's a very bad situation if you have a reversal in your capital and financial accounts, right? Or if you need those dollars to buy very basic goods, food, medicine, think about the vaccines, right? If you need dollars in order to get things that are desperately needed by your population, then it's a problem. But then MMT offers us a tremendous advantage, because when MMT tells us that fiscal constraint, that the availability of your own currency is not a problem, it's never a problem, it shouldn't be viewed as a problem, then you can use that to reduce that dependency on foreign currencies, right? Because you could have a policy that uses the capacity of the government to spend, and to spend as much as it wants, as long as the supply of the things that it's purchasing are being capable of increasing with the spending. Then if the government uses that capacity to build up its industrial powers, right, to build up its resiliency in terms of food production, medicine production, all of those things, then you will be a lot more well prepared to deal with the difficulties that could arise from exchange rate instability. So it's my contribution for now.
Thank you very much, Professor Daniel Conceição. It's really, MMT is really food for thought, since we are discussing economic policies worldwide and in Brazil. I would, if I may, I would ask Professor Randall Wray whether it is possible not to consider bond vigilantes, as you said, because in Brazil we see many authorities really stressing out the market about interest rates, as Professor Wray said and Professor Daniel Conceição said. It wouldn't be a problem, actually, if you could please consider and explain more this mechanism, why it shouldn't be a restraint on our economic policy. It would add a lot to our understanding of fiscal policy and monetary policy, of course.
Okay. Yeah. So actually, there was a dissertation, I think last year in Brazil, which showed that actually the interest rates in Brazil are set by the central bank exactly the same as in the United States. So if you look at, I know US data much better. If you look at the short-term interest rate, so say 30-day bonds, and the Fed's target, Fed funds rate target, the correlation between those two is 98%. If you look at 10-year bonds and the Fed's target, the correlation is 88%. Okay, so because the Fed does not directly target 10-year rates, but it does directly target the overnight rate, the 30-day is virtually the same as the Fed funds rate, because those are perfect substitutes, okay? The Fed doesn't try to target the 10-year rate, so it's not 100% correlation. It's 88%. That's pretty darn close, okay? If you keep the overnight rate low, the 10-year rate will be low, all right? And this is true in Brazil too. Now, it could be that it's not an 88% correlation, okay? It may be a little bit less than 88% for the longer term rates, but it's still going to be very high. If that's not good enough, the central bank can start targeting the long-term rates. No market is going to bet against the central bank because the central bank has infinite buying power, okay? So they can always set long-term rates too. Now, generally, they don't do that. In emergencies, they do. In the United States, the Fed set the long-term rate all during World War II. And so we had a long-term rate below 2% with a budget deficit of 25% of GDP. Okay. Can the central bank do it? Of course they can. They can set the long-term rate, okay, directly intervening. Okay, if that's still not good enough as an argument, tell the Treasury stop selling treasuries. Don't sell anymore. Okay, just don't sell them. Then you don't have to pay interest. Okay, the central bank will pay interest on reserves if they do. In the United States, the Fed is paying a very low interest rate on reserves. Just don't sell the treasuries. If people say, well, hold it a second, that's crazy. How could you possibly do that? Well, look, as Daniel was saying, look at the pandemic. Okay, what did the United States do in the pandemic? First, you have to remember, before the pandemic, we didn't raise taxes in preparation. We lowered taxes. We had a big tax cut by Trump, okay? And so that must have reduced our fiscal space, right? That must have reduced the government's ability to spend because we lowered tax revenue on purpose. Then the pandemic hits. Tax revenue continues to fall because people lose their jobs. That really constrains spending, right? No. We put together $9 trillion of new spending. 5 trillion of it has already been spent. We just passed another trillion, and Biden is trying for 3 more trillion. Okay, and the Treasury has issued very few new bonds. Okay, so we are not borrowing to pay for this, and we're not using tax revenue either. What are we doing? We're crediting bank reserves. So bank reserves have gone up by the trillions. Okay. And so people are saying, oh, well, this is helicopter money. Okay. This is some strange new thing that the Fed is doing. And by the way, Bank of England, same thing. Okay. No, it's not strange at all. The only thing we did is we left out the final step that we usually use when the government spends, which is you sell bonds. We just stopped doing that. We don't sell the bonds, okay? And so when the government spends, bank reserves are credited. You sell the bonds to drain the reserves out. We decided, let's just leave the reserves in. So that's what we've been doing. There's nothing new about it. All we did is leave out the final step. We don't sell the bonds. We just let the bank sit there with excess reserves, and they earn a very low interest rate. It costs the Treasury nothing because the Fed pays that interest. Now, in the end, because of the way we do things in the United States, Fed profits over a 6% return go to the Treasury. So if the Fed is less profitable because of all of this, it turns over less of its profits to the Treasury. So, finally, there is some cost to the Treasury, but it's just a balance sheet item. It's just a balance sheet cost. So, I mean, this is proof the vigilantes have no power. You can set the interest rate, or you can stop selling the bonds. Okay, either one of those takes them out of the equation.
Yeah, if I may, Pedro.
Of course, please.
Because in Brazil, as long as the central bank targets a rate that is connected to treasury bonds, right, which in the case of the Selic rate it is, then really there is absolutely no difficulty for the Treasury to sell its bonds. And remember that sales step that Professor Ray has mentioned, it didn't need to exist, right? But in Brazil and many other places, because we expect the treasury account at the central bank to be replenished, then it's a step that we force the treasury to practice, right? In other countries, for instance, in Canada, right, all it takes is for you to allow that account to go anywhere, to be negative if it needs to, and then the problem is eliminated. But in Brazil, we have fiscal rigidity and blindness really all over our constitution, right? And we expect that account not to fluctuate, and that's the only reason why the Treasury sells those bonds. But when it sells, there's no problem, because of the target that the central bank has set, which has nothing to do with government debt, right? Because they've actually explained it to us. It has to do with inflation expectations and their dealings with the private sector, right? They ask the private sector, what is the rate that you guys want? And then they'll say, oh, we expect inflation to be such and such. Then they'll run their Taylor rule and they come up, they spit out the value, and that's the value that they're supposed to set the Selic rate. And that's the rate. And the central bank will never not have the ability to set the Selic rate, because they can create money just by pressing a button, right? So the Selic rate will never go up, because that only requires money to be created. And now it won't even go up even if the central bank ran out of bonds, which they don't. But even if they did, they have the interest payment deposits that they'll use to drain reserves if there's ever excess reserves in the system. So it's never a problem for the central bank. It's almost as the buffer stock policy that we have in place has to do with setting the price of bonds. That's the buffer stock we have, right? If there's an excess supply of bonds, central bank immediately creates reserves to drain those. And if there's a shortage of bonds, they'll also offer those in order for the price to be given at the target. And so that sort of answers why is it that we shouldn't worry about the treasury ever running out of funds, which aren't money. That's the other thing. It's just an account that shows up that shows up in our controls, right? It's only for control. The second thing having to do with bond vigilance is that Professor Ray has stressed, and Caroline Jorge has a wonderful dissertation that shows this to the smallest detail. But the principle is easy to explain, because if you have a given interest rate that is perfectly targeted by the central bank, you know that that's the very minimum that you can get on any application, right? Any investment that you make, you can at least make that. Now, if you want to get a different instrument, right, that instrument should pay at least that rate, right? So that's the same for different government bonds, right? So you have the short-term bond that gives you the interest rate that you know, but you could change. You could say, well, I don't want that. I want another one that pays more. But here's the kicker, right? If the short-term rate is given and you know what it is, then it makes no sense for you to refuse a bond that is paying the decision of you going from the short term to the long run bond should always be, well, I'm going to purchase that if at least gives me the same return that I would get if I kept buying short-term bonds over the period that the longer term bond is paying, right? So if you buy a short-term bond and you get your earnings and you buy again, the compound of this should give you the longer term bond. Because if it doesn't, guess what? You should sell that and buy the long-term bond, right? Because it's the same issuer, it's the government. It's two bonds giving you different returns, but it's the same issuer. So it's like Pedro gives me the alternative of getting money after a year or getting money every month all the way to a year. If I'm only interested in the earnings, I will get whatever pays me the most, and I will shift in order to get what pays me the most. So there's always this shift. If there's ever a difference between the expected compound yields that come from short-term applications, people will buy the longer ones, and that drives the rate towards the short-term bond yields, which is the Selic rate. So what happens is the Selic rate keeps pulling down all of the other rates towards itself. Now, why isn't that perfect, right? Well, because people mess around, right? People can manipulate expectations. And in fact, the expected short-term rate in the future is not a given. It could change, right? So that very difference explains why is it that the longer-term rate could be a little bit over the compound short-term rate, because it's the expected rate, right? But if you know that the expected rate gives you the long-term rate, right, eventually it has to come towards it, unless you can convince other people that the short-term rate will change, which is what people do, right? So now in Brazil, what you have is a lot of people saying, well, the government is spending too much, the government debt is going up, you should sell bonds. They can't affect the Selic rate unless they convince the central bank to change its target, but they can affect the long-term, the rest of the curve, right? Which is what they do. And when they do it, they know that eventually the rates will come back to the compound, right, expected plus and current Selic rate, but it gives them the opportunity of doing what? If you convince other people of selling after you sold, well, you sell it for the highest price, then everyone else freaks out, they sell it as well, the price goes down, then you repurchase it again once it goes back down enough. And this is how people make a lot of money in these markets, right? But eventually, it is the short-term rate that has to determine the long-term rate, right? There could be volatility because of this messing around, but it's still being pulled by the short-term rate, which is what Carol has showed. And just to finish here, so if we agree that the short-term rate is targeted perfectly by the central bank, then we have to agree as well that all others are sort of determined mainly by this administrative decision. So it has nothing to do with too much debt, with the supposed risk of the government not having money. Because if the short-term one isn't related to, public debt to GDP ratio, all this kind of nonsense, then the long-term rates can be determined by that as well.
Thank you very much for your explanation. It's really good to hear your opinions on this subject. We can also mention that Daniel Conceição is director of the Institute of Functional Finance for Development in Brazil, and which is an institution really very good for disseminating these ideas and explaining how much we can count on this mainstream narrative in Brazil. Actually, perhaps we cannot rely much on it, and we perhaps we could go now for our last block of questions and answers for Professor Randall Wray and comments of Daniel Conceição. And we received a question, some questions from our audience, which relate exactly to inflation, but regarding commodity inflation. We could say it's a cost inflation. And what would MMT would say in respect to this? And also, if we can affirm that the government can, another question, if we can affirm that the government can spend without restrictions, and if the government's debt is not important, what about scarcity in economics? I believe we could we could have this last block of questions. Please, Professor Randall Wray, your comments. The floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah. So commodities prices can be an important component of the overall price level. And you guys, maybe you were a little too young to remember the early 1970s with the first oil price shock. OPEC quadruples the price of oil. Oil goes into the production of everything. Okay. They have market power. They were able to push up oil prices. And should anybody be surprised that the measured inflation rates go up? Of course not. Okay. An oil price shock is going to raise prices. Now, the question is, what's the best way to fight that inflation? Well, in the United States, what we did was we depressed demand. We used austerity. Okay. So we caused unemployment as our reaction to OPEC. Is that a good public policy? Okay. I would say no, of course not. It caused unnecessary suffering. It hurt our economy. It depressed investment. We went through stagflation, a decade of stagflation, and Japan surpassed us. What did Japan do? Japan conserved oil. They became energy efficient. That's the way they fought back against OPEC. So before OPEC, the US and Japan were about the same in terms of energy consumption per unit of output. Okay, we were both very inefficient in using energy because energy was cheap. Japan doubled their energy efficiency. The US did not. Okay, that's why Japan was able to take over. And in the 1980s, every newspaper was full of stories about how Japan had overtaken us and how we had to adopt Japanese business methods because they were doing so much better. 17 or something like that out of the top 20 banks in the world were Japanese. Japan was taking over the world. Okay, that is in part due to our response to stagflation. If we had become more energy efficient and started producing Ford cars that got good gas mileage, General Motors cars that got good gas mileage, we wouldn't have lost the automobile market to Japanese cars. Okay, so what I'm saying is, of course, prices will go up if important commodities go up in price. But you have to think about what is a good response to that. Austerity is not a good response. Okay, more recently, speculation dominates commodities now. It's speculation by Wall Street. Okay, it's the futures contracts. I wrote about this for a 2008 Levy piece where I looked into it in detail. There are 25 globally traded commodities. They went up by an average of something like 400%. It was pure speculation. It had nothing to do with demand and supply. Goldman Sachs got a corner on the aluminum market. Okay, they just took aluminum out of the market. They bought warehouses, and instead of shipping the aluminum to Budweiser, one of the biggest aluminum users for the beer, they held it off the market to drive up the price. What's the right response to that? Stop Wall Street from speculating in commodities. Okay, again, austerity is not the right response to commodities price inflation. Okay, now inflation can come from other things. Food also is important, but that's indirectly oil again. And in the United States, because of the way we measure housing prices, that contributed to our high inflation. But not one of those should have been tackled by austerity, which is what we did. And then we did it again with Jimmy Carter in the Reagan years by bringing in Volcker in the second OPEC price hike, which came in 1979. But that time we did have one rational policy, which was the deregulated natural gas. and we had a boom of natural gas. So instead of becoming more energy efficient, we just found more energy and brought the price down. Okay, so that's somewhat rational. Okay, for the long term, it wasn't, because it is dooming all of us, right, to climate change. Okay, can the government spend without restriction? No government should ever spend without restriction. They need to be accountable. You need to have a budgeting process. Okay, so you need a Congress or Parliament in the United States. They propose the budget. Sorry, actually, the president first proposes one, but Congress doesn't have to take it. They do their own, and then they pass it, and then the president signs it. That constrains the government. Okay, that is a good constraint. Now, are the priorities all correct? Is the total amount correct? You know, we could argue about that. The priorities might be wrong, too much for the military, not enough for healthcare, and maybe the total amount is not the right amount. But we never have government spending without constraint. Okay, that would be terrible policy. We do want to constrain them. What should be the constraint? Resources. Okay, you don't want the government to be going beyond full employment and continuing to raise its bid, because the government can always win by placing the highest bid, because the government doesn't have to be profitable. So it can always bid resources away from the private sector and chase the price up. Okay, that's a bad policy, except in a time of war, a time of pandemic, you know, where it's in the public interest to move the resources into the government sector. So we don't want the government to spend without restriction. Just want to make that clear. But what we're arguing is that money is not the restriction. Okay, first there's the budget that has to be approved. And second, that budget should take into account your resources. If you don't have enough resources to do everything you want to do, you have to prioritize, or you have to move resources away from the private sector. And to face all of the pandemics we are facing now, so there's COVID, but there's also a much bigger one, which is we have 10 years to save human life. Okay, if we don't do it in the next 10 years, there will be no civilizations. Okay, it is that drastic. So, you know, that should be a top priority, and we should be spending more on that. The last one, another thing that people say is, oh, MMT says debts don't matter, deficits don't matter. That isn't what we say at all. Okay, the deficit has an impact on the economy. It's a balancing item. If the private sector wants to run a surplus, that is, the private sector wants to spend less than its income, and if you're like the United States, we import more than we export, that means the rest of the world wants to run a surplus against us, the balancing item has to be the government's deficit. Okay, at the aggregate level, the sum of those has to be zero. If one sector runs a deficit, at least one other must be running a surplus. So the typical case in the United States is our government's deficit equals our private sector surplus plus the rest of the world's surplus against us. Okay, and it's a balancing item. Okay, it's important to have that balancing item. And for most countries in the world, the government will need to be in a deficit. Does that mean that MMT always supports deficit spending? No, not at all. Those other two balances have to be taken into account. If you are a major exporter, like some Asian countries, and it may be appropriate to have a budget surplus, okay, to offset that current account surplus. So it could be appropriate to have budget surplus. So we don't advocate that everybody run a deficit or that you try to maximize your deficit. We say you should set your budget according to the principles of functional finance. Set your budget at the right level to achieve the public purpose. Okay? And let the tax revenue go wherever it goes. And usually what happens is you set your budget where what's appropriate for public policy. Your tax revenue will go up if you grow fast, and you will move toward a balanced budget automatically. If the private sector is not spending a lot and you don't grow fast, then the tax revenue will fall and the deficit will expand. So the deficit is a balancing item in that way too. So it balances the other two sectors, but it's also an automatic stabilizer. So it will settle at the right level. You don't worry about what the budgetary outcome will be. It will be the right level. You worry about your public policy. You know, how much should you spend on healthcare? How much should you spend on the military? How much should you spend on infrastructure? That's what matters. And make sure you have the resources and the know-how to do it. What about the government debt? So some MMT proponents, Warren Mosler, Bill Mitchell, argue that we should stop issuing government debt. Okay? Because remember, it's not needed for borrowing. We can just leave reserves in the banking system. We could either pursue a zero interest rate policy, ZIRP, pay zero on those reserves, or we could pursue a low positive overnight interest rate target, say 0.5%, and then don't sell the bonds. Okay, that's pretty much what we've been doing in the United States and in Britain. They argue that the government bond sales are just a subsidy. High income people hold government bonds. Financial institutions hold government bonds. Offshore banking centers hold sovereign debt. And paying interest on that is just subsidizing those activities. Why are we doing that? Why are we subsidizing rich people who want to hold government bonds as a safe asset? Okay. And I think that, this is perfectly reasonable arguments. If we're going to continue to sell bonds, I would say we should target them and say only people below some income level, say only low income and middle income people are entitled to buy them. And then we would pay an interest rate that is determined by public policy. Why do we want to do that? We want to give a perfectly safe asset for lower income people to save in so that they don't have to take any risk. Okay, it's just a matter of public policy to encourage saving by low income people. In the United States, we used to do that. Okay, they're called savings bonds. And we pay, you can pay a generous interest rate to encourage saving by low income people. So I think that could be a public policy that is that makes sense for some countries anyway. Otherwise, yeah, I agree with them. We don't need to sell bonds so that rich people can have a really safe asset that earns a positive return. There's no sense in that. Or for foreigners to hold a perfectly safe asset that has a high return. It's hard to see any public interest in doing that. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's really good to hear that those proposals of public policy. Perhaps Professor Daniel Conceição would like to comment, and we would then move forward to our last comments in our conversation. Professor Daniel?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think that it's a very useful idea to view, right, monetary policy and basically interest rate setting in the economy as a functional tool. Right? So yeah, it's a strange way of trying to influence economic results, because you're basically paying an income for people who already were able to accumulate a lot. Right? So that is an unfortunate result from that policy. But the policy itself gives you a price that, if targeted well, could introduce some elements of stability that are perhaps useful in the economy, because it basically sets the rate of discount for for prices that are observed at different time points, right? So if you have prices that are temporarily detached, and people want to make a choice between those two assets, right, income yielding assets, that referential point, right, the price of one bond that is given by the central bank will be a useful set of point of reference. Now, the other point is, unfortunately, what we do with monetary policy is we try to affect rich people's behaviors and financial institutions' behaviors, right? Portfolio behaviors. So mainly what we're trying to do is to say, well, do this with your money, because that will give you a guaranteed yield, as opposed to doing other things, for instance, purchasing foreign currencies. Right? So that's something that we try to do. It's sort of giving them the income so that they don't mess up the economy in ways that are undesirable. Right? So but that's to look at monetary policy in a functional way. Right? What are we trying to achieve? Why is it that we're giving these people free money to do that? And then there's a point here that I think would be very interesting, because it is true what Professor said. We don't need to give that money to people who have already accumulated a lot. Right? The only reason why we do that is because the way we operationalize government payments today is via private banks. So when a government makes a payment to me, for instance, right, I'm a government employee, I get my money via a bank that creates bank money. And then as an offsetting operation, right, they get reserves that then they can invest in bonds and get basically free income. Right? So anyone who has reserves can access those bonds, but only if you have the chance to access bond markets, which is almost none of the population. And especially because Tesouro Direto in Brazil is very, the minimum application there is not very low. But most people don't even have the opportunity to setting money aside to pursuing those interest earning opportunities. Now, that is not something that we need to do, right? Today, for instance, if governments wished to just give us digital state money, we didn't even need to go through commercial banks. And then the basic rate, right, the referential interest rate for the economy could be just the yields that the government paid us, the central bank paid us on digital state monies. That would be the exact same result as today. We have an alternative to state money, but it would be accessible to anyone, right? As long as you had the digital account in your name. Now, I think that would be a much more fair use of monetary policy. It would give you the same result in terms of offering a basic interest rate, right, for trying to stabilize other prices in the economy, especially if they're temporarily detached. But it wouldn't give rich people that income that is made, that is an offset of that policy. So I think there's a lot there. We should really not keep ourselves from questioning the unavoidability of having to pay interests to rich people as a fact of life. We don't need to do that. We could have digital state monies for people. It would be just an account for people at the central bank, and that could be an interest yielding account that would do exactly what bond operations, bond sales, and now the interest earning deposits at the Fed will do, right? So that's one thing. And just another detail, because I saw that some people were imagining that we were calling for no limit spending, right? And Professor Ray said that's not at all what we're advocating for. In fact, what we're doing here is revealing a lie that has been told to us, that governments do face a budget constraint on their ability to spend. It is never a budget constraint. What we have today are conditionalities, right? So we force the government to observe some sort of accounting result, in order to allow the government to spend. And this is completely arbitrary, artificial. We invent those conditionalities. It could very well be that we force the president to do push-ups before the government can spend. It is equally arbitrary, right? So what we do today is pretend that we have a budget constraint, which really has to do with, can I get the money to spend? We saw that that's not an issue for a government, but we could very well have useful, functional conditionalities that say, well, your spendings should be planned. So planning really is the best tool to keep governments from messing up if they can spend as much as they want. Of course, the government should never go about and give $1 million, $1 million reais to every Brazilian, right? Because that wouldn't fit the economy. It would be too much. It would cause tremendous inflationary pressures and possibly, cause our economy to go into disarray. But we used to think that we couldn't give them 600 reais a month, right? And then the pandemic came, and for a long time we were paying 600 reais to every person who could show that they were socially and economically vulnerable. And that actually fit the economy. In fact, we had families getting twice that much, and it fit the economy. It wasn't the cause of inflation, right? In fact, the economy still collapsed. We still had a recession of about 5%, right? So our product, our national income has actually fallen because it wasn't as much. The government didn't spend as much, right? So what I'm saying is there needs to be a lot of conditionalities that make the government's budget fit well the economy. But a very bad conditionality is one that pretends that the government doesn't have money, that pretends that the government should balance its budget, because that conditionality usually leads to very poor results. It causes governments to almost always spend too little. And then it almost always causes unemployment, causes a lot of waste, and a lot of unnecessary suffering.
Thank you very much, Professor Daniel Conceição and Professor Randall Wray. It's really fantastic to hear those critics and those different views on the economy and on public policy. I think we don't have any more questions right now, and we could have some finishing remarks by Professor Randall Wray and Professor Daniel Conceição. If you please, Professor Randall Wray, some finishing remarks, and then I believe we
can I just raise my...
Despite our technical problems, we accomplished this.
I would actually like to give up my time, and let's have Professor Ray.
Sorry, Professor Daniel
close. Yeah, I just want to thank you guys for the opportunity. Thank you, Professor Ray, and thank you, Corecon.
Okay, I'll be very brief. So, what we're trying to do is to change the conversation away from what I think is fear mongering, and it's intentional. That the spending too much causes inflation. That too much government spending crowds out private spending. That too much debt exposes the nation to bankruptcy. The government will go bankrupt. It won't be able to make all of its promised payments. Too much government spending will cause your currency to collapse. Okay? So first, just empirically, these things are not true. And, we could provide the graphs to show that the correlations do not fit. In the United States, the debt ratio has been going up. The interest rate has been going down. Okay. The inflation rate has been going down. The debt ratio has been going up. Okay. I'm talking about the last few decades. Okay. So it's going in exactly the opposite direction of what everyone says. If you look at the extreme cases of hyperinflation is very, very rare. Okay. It has never hit a democratic capitalist country that was well functioning. It's always cases of civil war. It's always a case of collapse of the supply side of the economy. It's not a case of the government spending too much. It's a case of the supply side collapses. So, so these are episodes, they're rare, but you can empirically look at them. Those also don't fit the story of a country like the United States or a country like Brazil today, starting off with too much government spending and the inflation rate creeps up, and then you end up with hyperinflation with inflation rates of thousands of percent per year. It just doesn't happen that way. Okay. And then we also can look at evidence the other direction, which is what has happened in all the major countries since the pandemic hit, when everyone said, well, now we're in a special emergency, so we're going to forget about the budget constraints and we're just going to spend. And as Daniel said, you mail checks to everybody. And you find out, first, you don't run out of money. Okay. Congress might eventually stop passing the spending bills, but it's just not true. We always had the money. Okay. We always could have done this. And second, interest rates don't go up. They stay right at zero. In inflation, if we were ever going to have inflation, it should have happened early in 2020 when people started getting the checks, because the supply side had collapsed. So we all got checks and we had unemployment rates, the highest since the Great Depression. Okay. So the supply side collapsed, but we didn't get inflation. Okay. No inflation. Now, I know that prices are starting to rise a bit. The Fed's not worried about it. I'm not worried about it. It is going to be, I think, self-limiting. If production ever comes back, we're all hoping that it will be self-limiting. Okay. So money's not the problem. We're trying to change the focus to what the real problems are. Okay. And that doesn't mean the real problems are easy. They're not easy. Okay. So the real problems are your resources that are available. For the developed capitalist countries, this isn't a major problem. We have the capacity to adequately feed, clothe, shelter all of our populations easily. Okay. For the developing world, this is a problem. Resource constraints are a real constraint. You may not be able to feed all of your population at reasonable levels. Okay, so you have to increase the supply capacity of the economy. You have to develop. Okay, and understanding that that's the constraint, not money, can help you development. Doesn't make it easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but at least you know you have the money to do it. Okay, it can still be very, very difficult to do. It also means this has been a bad word for 50 years among the developed capitalist world, at least.
Principalmente no mundo capitalista.
What? Sorry. You have to plan, okay? Because you have to prioritize. So you're going to utilize your resources. You want to move to full employment, but you have to plan to make sure that you are doing things in the public interest. So in other words, it matters what you spend on. It's not a matter of just saying, well, you have unemployment, so let's spend more. You have to plan what you're going to spend on. So it requires planning. And dealing with the multiple pandemics that we face will require a lot of planning. Okay, dealing with COVID, almost no country in the world did a good job at dealing with COVID yet. The planning was not sufficient. And the climate crisis is even a bigger problem. And we haven't really even started on that one. That's going to require planning, international cooperation. Okay, so MMT doesn't make that easier. It just helps you to focus on that. Okay, we don't have to worry about where will the money come from to fight climate change. Okay, sovereign governments, they have the money, but we have to put the resources to work to reverse climate change. And that's the difficult part. The money part is easy. So anyway, that's what MMT is trying to do. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor. Perhaps you could hear some concluding remarks by Professor Daniel Conceição.
Well, I just would like to add that I agree a lot with this final message, right? I think this is what we should understand here. MMT doesn't solve all of our challenges. It just allows us not to waste time thinking that something that is not a problem is. Right? It's not because we don't have the money. We might not have the other stuff, but at least we don't need to worry about debt to GDP ratios and the possibility of the government running out of money. All right, so with that said, I just want to thank you guys from Corecon, from Cofecon, for organizing this. This has given us a wonderful opportunity to spread the word and to receive some of the feedback from Brazilian economists. I want to again thank Professor Ray. He knows he's been a very influential figure for helping me think about economics. The book is right there. I always keep it on the shelf. Understanding Modern Money has been where this journey has started, for me at least, and I know for a lot of people. And I want to thank Professor Ray for being here with us and giving us the opportunity to bounce ideas and move forward with this, because it's going to be useful for Brazilians if we understand this.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Randall Wray, for your time and your explanation of all of these topics. It's been a wonderful afternoon with being listening to some really good thoughts about rethinking economics, rethinking economic policy, and rethinking economic development in general. And thank you, of course, Professor Daniel Conceição, for your time and your comments. It's been wonderful to hear you. I believe we should thank our audience and everyone else for listening to us. It will be recorded and will be available to everyone after we finish. Thank you very much in the name of our president, Cesar Bergo, the president of Corecon-DF, the Regional Council of Economics of the Distrito Federal in Brasilia. And good evening here in Brazil, good afternoon there in where Professor Randall Ray is. And thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.